They did not build the ossuary pit to be survived. They built it to be watched. It hung in the belly of a station called Grelmer's Deep, a rust-colored world of docking rings and gambling halls that orbited a dead star at the edge of civilized space. Ships came here to be forgotten. Debts came here to be settled. And creatures came here, hauled in cargo holds and stasis crates, to die in front of an audience that had paid handsomely for the privilege of not caring whether they lived. The pit itself was a bowl of black stone 40 meters across, sunk into the station's core like a wound that had never healed. Tiered seating rose around it in concentric rings, thousands of seats filled with 100 different species, each of them leaning forward against the transparent barrier that separated spectator from spectacle. Below, in the bowl, the light was deliberately dim. The Cathari who ran the place understood that fear lived in the almost scene. They kept the floor shadowed and the water at the bottom deeper than it looked, and they let the imagination of the crowd do half the work. For 12 seasons, no combatant had walked out of the ossuary pit on their own feet. Some were carried. Most were not recovered at all. The beasts saw to that. On the night this story begins, the beasts had been starved for 3 days. Osric Vane, magnate of the pit and owner of everything the light touched in that district, stood in his private box above the bowl and watched his handlers prod the final crates into position. He was a Cathari of the old breeding, broad across the shoulders with a hide the gray of wet slate, and he wore his wealth in the form of 6 rings on each of his 3-fingered hands. He had grown bored. That was the trouble with success. He had seen every kind of prey thrown into his pit, had watched them beg and run and fight and die, and none of it moved him any more. The crowd still roared. Osric only counted the coin. "The human is ready," said his floor master, a thin, nervous creature named Pell whose species had no name Osric had ever bothered to learn. "Human," Osric turned the word over. "The little Deathworld thing, from the mining claim." "The same, Voss, Mara Voss. She was working an unlicensed dig in the Tannic Belt. Your collectors brought her in against the debt her crew ran up." "And the crew?" "Scattered, sold. She is the last asset." Osric made a low sound in his throat, the Cathari equivalent of a shrug. He had never seen a human in the pit. Deathworlders as a category were a novelty. The galaxy knew of humans the way it knew of a rumor that would not die, creatures from a planet that should not have produced anything but corpses, a world of storms and predators and gravity that pulled at the bones, and yet the humans had crawled out of it stubborn and strange and unkillable in ways that made polite species uncomfortable. Osric did not believe the stories. Stories were for selling tickets. "How large is she?" he asked. Pell hesitated. "Small. For the crowd she will look like nothing. That is why I brought her to you first. If we announce her as the main event and she dies in 9 seconds, the crowd will feel cheated. But if we open with her, warm the beasts, let her run a while before the warden takes her, the night keeps its shape." Osric considered this. Pell was a coward, but cowards understood audiences because cowards spent their lives reading rooms for the exit. "Open with her then," Osric said, "but show her the warden first. I want her to know what is coming. A quiet death is worth nothing. A death that has been anticipated is worth the whole card." Down in the holding tunnels beneath the seating, where the air smelled of old blood and cleaning chemicals, and the animal reek of things that ate other things, Mara Voss sat on a bench of cold metal and worked a splinter out of her palm. She was 23 years old. She was, as Pell had said, small, a compact woman with a miner's forearms and a burn scar along one wrist from a plasma cutter that had bitten back. Her hair was dark and cut short and practical, and her eyes were the flat brown of river stones. She did not look like a legend. She looked like what she was, which was a person who had spent her short life digging ore out of asteroids that wanted to kill her, working shifts in a vacuum suit 40 hours long, sleeping in a bunk the size of a coffin, and asking nothing from the universe except that it let her keep breathing. The universe had declined. 2 guards stood at the tunnel mouth, both of them armored, both of them holding shock poles that hummed with a charge she could hear from across the room. Neither had spoken to her. That was fine. She had nothing to say to them. She got the splinter out, looked at the bead of blood that welled up in its place, and pressed her thumb over it until it stopped. Small hurts. You dealt with the small hurts because the large ones would deal with you regardless. She was not calm. Let that be understood. Anyone who told you they felt nothing walking toward a thing like the ossuary pit was lying, and Mara had never had much use for liars. Her heart was going hard and steady behind her ribs, and there was a cold electric wire running up the back of her neck, and some animal part of her brain was screaming at her to get up and run and keep running until her legs gave out. She knew that feeling. She had felt it in a collapsing shaft on the Tannic claim, felt it when the atmosphere alarm went off on a dead man's watch, felt it every time the void had reached for her and missed. She had learned a long time ago that the fear was not the enemy. The fear was information. The fear was a tool, if you could keep your hands from shaking long enough to hold it. So she breathed. She counted the breaths, the way old Deller had taught her in the mines, back before Deller had gone out an airlock owing money to people like the ones who owned this station. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The oldest trick there was, and it worked, because the body was a stupid loyal animal and you could lie to it with your lungs. A door opened at the far end of the tunnel. Pell came through it, flanked by 2 more guards, and behind him rolled a viewing screen on a hovering stand. The floor master approached her the way a person approaches a snake they have been told is defanged, but do not entirely trust. "Human," Pell said, "you are the opening act tonight. Do you understand what that means?" "It means you want me to run before you kill me," Mara said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. Good. The body could be lied to. Pell's expression flickered. "It means you have been chosen for a great honor. Thousands will watch you. In the whole history of this station, only 12 of your kind have ever been given the pit." "You have never had a human in there before," Mara said. "You just told me that without meaning to." The floor master stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that might have been the first flicker of unease. Then he collected himself and gestured at the screen. "The magnate wishes you to see what waits below. It is customary. Watch." The screen woke. Mara watched. At first the image was only the dark water at the bottom of the bowl, still and black and reflecting the dim light in oily ribbons. Then the water moved. Not rippled. Moved the way the surface of a thing moves when something enormous shifts beneath it. A shape rose and kept rising, and Mara felt the animal part of her brain go very quiet, which was worse than screaming. It was called the Warden. Osrek had bought it from a broker who had pulled it half-dead from the crushing depths of a drowned Deathworld called Ith, a planet of black oceans and no land, where the pressure at the bottom would fold a starship like paper. The thing that lived there had been evolving to hunt in absolute darkness and killing cold for longer than most civilizations had possessed language. It was 30 meters from blunt snout to the tip of its lashing tail. It was armored in plates of a bone-white keratin that had gone gray with age and captivity. It had rows of teeth like a picket fence made of knives, and it had no eyes at all, because eyes were useless where it came from, and instead it sensed the world through a lateral net of pits along its flanks that read the water for the faintest tremor of a beating heart. It surfaced, took in air it did not strictly need, and sank again. And the whole thing had taken perhaps 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds Mara understood the shape of the night that had been arranged for her. Pell was watching her face. He had watched a great many faces watch that screen, and he knew the sequence. First the eyes widened. Then the breath quickened. Then always came the tears or the pleading or the sudden desperate bargaining, the offers of money that did not exist and services that would never be rendered. None of it came. Mara Voss looked at the largest predator she had ever seen, a thing built by a world crueler than her own, and after a moment she tilted her head slightly, the way a person does when they are looking at a problem rather than a nightmare. "It is blind," she said. Pell blinked. "What?" "No eyes. It is hunting by feel, pressure or sound or both." She leaned closer to the screen, not away from it. "That is a deep water build, really deep. Down where there is no light at all, so eyes cost more than they are worth and evolution throws them out." She said this the way another person might comment on the weather. "How is it doing up here in your nice shallow tank? Cannot be comfortable. Wrong pressure. Wrong cold. You are keeping a deep thing in a shallow bowl. That has got to hurt it." The floor master stared at her. This was not the sequence. There was no version of the sequence in which the prey felt sorry for the monster. "You are about to die," Pell said, and there was an edge in it now, a defensive brittleness, because she had done something he had not planned for, and cowards hate nothing so much as the unplanned. "You understand this. That creature will find you in the dark by the sound of your own blood. There is nowhere in the pit you can hide from it. The greatest hunters of 40 worlds have gone into that water, and none have come out." "I heard you the first time," Mara said. She sat back on the bench. Her hands, she noticed with distant approval, had stopped shaking. Somewhere between the splinter and the screen they had made up their minds. "I am not saying I am not scared. I am saying I looked like you asked. And I saw a blind old animal that got dragged up out of the only home it ever knew and stuck in a tank that is slowly killing it so that a rich man could sell tickets. I know how that feels. I grew up in it." She looked up at Pell, and for the first time the flat brown eyes were not flat at all. There was something behind them, something that had been forged in 40-hour shifts and collapsing shafts, and the particular fury of a person who has been treated as an asset for so long that she has begun to hate the very word. "You keep calling it a monster," Mara said quietly, "but it did not build the pit. You did." Pell had no answer for that. He gestured sharply, and the screen went dark, and he retreated up the tunnel faster than his dignity should have allowed. The guards moved in. They took Mara by the arms, and she did not fight them, because fighting them was not the plan, and Mara Voss had begun, against all reason and in the last place anyone would expect it, to form a plan. They marched her up a ramp toward a gate of black iron, and beyond the gate she could hear the crowd, the vast layered murmur of thousands of voices waiting to be entertained by her death. The sound of it should have broken her. Instead she found it clarifying. All those voices, all those species, all that money, and every single one of them had come to watch a small blind animal and a small stubborn woman tear each other apart for their amusement. Mara thought about the warden, folded into that too shallow tank, hunting in a dark that no longer hid anything worth hunting. She thought about the word asset and the word monster, and how the two words were spoken by the same mouths. The gate began to rise. Above, in his private box, Osric Vane leaned forward and signaled his announcer to begin. The crowd's murmur swelled toward a roar. Handlers along the rim of the bowl readied the goads that would drive the beasts, and in the dark water far below, the blind old thing from the drowned world turned its long body toward the vibration of an opening gate and a single small heartbeat, steady and slow and utterly unafraid. The gate finished rising, and the light hit her. They had built the entrance so that combatants stepped out onto a narrow ledge of black stone that ran along one curved wall of the bowl, 3 meters above the water. From there the whole arena opened out, and from there the crowd could see the new arrival framed against the dark, small and alone and freshly delivered to whatever waited below. It was a piece of theater, that ledge. Everything in the ossuary pit was a piece of theater. Mara stepped out onto it, and the roar of the crowd broke over her like surf. For a moment it was overwhelming, a physical wall of sound, thousands of voices in a dozen registers, hooting and shrieking and drumming their feet against the tiers. Spotlights swung down and pinned her, and she raised one hand against the glare, and the crowd howled louder because they read the gesture as fear. Let them. She was using the moment for something else. She was learning the room. Under the noise, under the light, Mara made herself go still and take inventory the way she took inventory of a new shaft before she trusted it with her life. The bowl was roughly circular. The water at the bottom filled most of it, dark and flat, perhaps a dozen meters below her ledge at its nearest lip. Around the waterline ran a discontinuous rim of stone, broken islands and shelves of black rock, some barely awash, some standing a meter or two proud of the surface. Escape routes of a kind. Places to stand. The handler's goad ports studded the upper walls at intervals, dark slots from which the keepers could jab charged poles to drive a reluctant beast toward the killing. And across the water, set into the far wall below the seating, she counted the gates. Not one, 5. 5 gates meant 5 beasts, or 5 holding pens, and the starvation Pell had mentioned meant every one of them would come out hungry. She filed that away and kept looking, because looking was the only weapon they had let her keep. The announcer's voice rolled out over the bowl, amplified until it buzzed in her teeth, first in the trade tongue and then in 3 other languages she did not know. She caught her own name in the noise, Mara Voss, and the word human and the word deathworlder, and each time the crowd made a sound and the sound had a shape to it she recognized. It was the sound of people who had been promised something small and disappointing. She looked like nothing to them. Good. She had spent her whole life looking like nothing to people who owned her, and every one of them had been wrong. Then the announcer said another word, and the tone of the crowd changed, sharpened, hushed at its edges, and Mara did not need the translation because the water was already moving. The warden came first. It did not rush. It rose. The black surface bulged and split and the long gray body slid up out of it, and kept coming until a length of the creature longer than a transport shuttle lay half-breached in the dim light, streaming water, the blind, blunt head turning slowly at the end of it. The crowd went nearly silent. Even they, who had seen it before, felt the old animal part of themselves respond to a shape that big and that patient. The warden turned its head, and the rows of sensory pits along its flanks flushed a faint bioluminescent blue as they drank in the vibrations of the bowl, and it oriented, unmistakably, on the small warm heartbeat standing on the ledge. Mara looked down at the thing that had been built to end her, and she did the one thing that no combatant in 12 seasons had ever done. She sat down. She lowered herself to the cold stone of the ledge, let her legs hang over the edge above the water, and made her body as small and slow and unthreatening as she could. She let her shoulders drop. She unclenched her hands and laid them open on her knees. She slowed her breathing, deliberately, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, and she kept her eyes soft and half-lidded, not staring, because a stare was a challenge in every predator language she had ever heard of, and she was betting her life that the grammar held across the stars. In the private box, Osric leaned forward with a frown creasing his slate-gray brow. "What is she doing?" "Freezing," said Pell, though he did not sound certain. "Pray freeze, it happens. She will run when it comes closer." "She is not frozen," Osric said slowly. "Frozen things do not breathe like that. Look at her chest. She is doing that on purpose." Down in the bowl, the warden hung in the water and read the room, and something in the room did not make sense to it. For 19 years, everything the warden had ever sensed on that ledge had done the same thing. It had spiked. That was the word, if the warden had possessed words, for what living prey did in the moment before the water took them. Their hearts climbed. Their limbs jerked. They flooded the water with the frantic percussion of terror, and to a creature that hunted by feeling the panic of other creatures, that spike was a dinner bell, a bright hot signature that said here is a thing that knows it is about to die, come and end it. The warden had been rewarded 10,000 times for chasing the spike. The spike meant food. The spike meant the goads would stop. The spike was the entire shape of its shrunken world. The small warm thing on the ledge did not spike. The warden edged closer, its sensory net flushing brighter, straining to read a signature it did not have a category for. The heartbeat was there, yes, small and quick as all warm land things were, but it was steady. It was slowing. As the warden drew nearer, as it brought its blind bulk to within a body length of the ledge, the little heartbeat did not climb toward the killing spike. It settled. It went quiet and even and deep. The way the sea went quiet in the deep places the warden half remembered. The still black cold before all this light and noise and hunger. And something in the old creature that had not stirred in 19 years turned over in its sleep. Mara felt the water displacement before she saw it, a slow, cool pressure of moving mass, and every instinct she owned screamed at her to scramble back from the edge. She did not. She had made her decision in the tunnel and she was going to hold it, because half a plan executed with total commitment beat a whole plan executed with a flinch. She kept her breathing slow. She kept her hands open. And when the blunt gray head rose out of the water directly below her, close enough that she could see the fine tracery of scars across the ancient hide and smell the deep cold reek of it, she did not pull away. She spoke to it. She did not know why she chose words. It could not understand words. But there was a thing that happened under the words, a low, steady tone, the register a person used with a spooked animal or a frightened child or themselves in the dark of a stalled suit 40 hours into a shift. And that tone was older than any language, and she trusted it more than she trusted the crowd. "Hey," she said softly under the noise of the arena just for the two of them. "Hey, there you are, big one, I see you, I know. It is loud up here and it is too bright and the water is all wrong and you are so far from home. I know, me too." The warden hung in the water below her, and its sensory pits pulsed their slow blue light, and it did not strike. The crowd did not understand what they were seeing, and so they began, in scattered pockets, to boo. Osric did not boo. Osric had gone very still in his box, and the frown had smoothed off his face into something more dangerous, which was attention. He had been bored for a long time. He was not bored now. "Pell," he said, "the goads, drive it. I want the strike." Pell relayed the order, and along the upper wall the handlers slid their charged poles out through the goad ports, and one of them found the warden's flank and discharged. The old creature convulsed. A ripple of agony ran the length of its enormous body, and it thrashed, and the water heaved, and for one sick, lurching instant Mara thought it was going to come apart into the mindless fury they wanted from it and take her with it. She gripped the stone. But she did not scream, and she did not pull back, and when the spasm passed and the warden's blunt head swung wildly, seeking the source of the pain, it swung not toward the small, still thing that had spoken to it in the low, kind voice, but up the wall, toward the port from which the goad had struck. Mara saw it turn away from her. She saw where it was looking, and in that instant, cold and clear as vacuum, she understood something that would change the entire shape of the night. The warden was not confused about who its enemy was. It had simply, for 19 years, been unable to reach them. "That is it," she breathed. "That is it. It is not you they should be afraid of." It never was. The goad struck again, and the warden roared, a sound that came up out of the water and shook the barrier glass in its frame, a sound of such depth and grief and rage that half the crowd flinched back in their seats. And Mara Voss, small and alone on her ledge above the dark, did the second thing that no combatant in 12 seasons had ever done. She stood up, and she turned her back on the beast, and she looked up at the goad port and the handler inside it, and she pointed at him, so that thousands of watching eyes followed the line of her arm, and she shouted into the sudden ringing quiet after the roar, in a voice that carried further than anyone that size had a right to carry. "You are hurting him for you," she shouted. "Not for me, for you. So you can sell what happens next. Look at him. Look. He has not touched me. He could have ended me a dozen times and he has not touched me, and you cannot stand it, so you are going to torture him until he does something ugly enough to be worth your ticket price." The trade tongue was a common speech and most of the bowl understood her. A strange thing began to move through the crowd, a murmur, a discomfort, the particular unease of a mob that has been shown its own reflection at an inconvenient angle. They had come to watch a monster kill a girl. They were watching something else. They did not yet know what it was, but they knew it was not what they had paid for, and that uncertainty was, to a showman like Osric Vane, more dangerous than any beast in the water. Again, Osric snapped. All of them, open the other gates, enough of this. Pell's 3 fingers hovered over the controls. All of them, magnate, at once. The other beasts are nautically. All of them, Osric said. Drown the little speech in teeth, now. 4 more gates ground open along the far wall, and out of them, blinking and furious and starving, came the rest of the ossuary pit's collection. The things that Osric Vane had bought from a dozen Deathworlds to feed the appetite of a crowd that was never, ever satisfied. And Mara Voss, standing on her ledge with her back to the oldest and largest of them, watched the water fill with predators and understood that her plan had just gone from difficult to nearly impossible, and that she was going to try it anyway, because nearly impossible was the only number she had ever been given, and she had made a whole life out of it. They came out of the gates like grievances given flesh. From the first gate came a pack of 6 lean gray hunters the crowd called Drenig, 4-legged and low-slung, and covered in a bristling quill hide, with long jaws and eyes that reflected the spotlights back in flat gold discs. They were pack animals from a scrubland Deathworld, coursers built to run prey to exhaustion across open plains, and being kept in a lightless pen for months had wound them so tight that they came out already snarling, already looking for something to blame. From the second gate came a thing that walked on 2 legs and dragged its knuckles, a heavy-shouldered brute the size of a cargo loader, its skin a warty slate blue, a low ridge of horn along its skull. It roared when the light hit it and slammed one fist against the stone hard enough that Mara felt the vibration through her feet from across the bowl. Osric's card called it the Breaker. It came from a heavy-gravity world, and it had been bred in captivity for exactly one quality, which was the willingness to hit things. From the third gate came something worse in its way, because it made no sound at all. It flowed rather than walked, a boneless dark mass the color of a bruise that poured itself down onto a rock shelf and sat there rippling, and where its surface caught the light Mara saw dozens of small reflections that might have been eyes or might have been something else. Nobody in the crowd had a good name for it. The card called it the Silence. From the fourth gate came a swimmer, a sleek finned shape that hit the water and was gone under the surface in an instant, leaving only a widening ring. And Mara marked its gate and marked the ring, and knew that of all of them that was the one whose position she would lose track of, which meant that was the one that could kill her without warning. And in the center of the bowl, in the deep water, the warden hung and waited and read the room, and the room had just filled with rivals. Mara stood on her ledge and did the arithmetic in the cold, clear part of her mind that the mines had built. 5 kinds of predator, 5 different Deathworlds, 5 different sets of instincts, prey drives, threat displays, hungers. If she had been trying to fight them, she would already be dead. But she was not trying to fight them, and that changed every number on the board. Here was the thing that Osric Vane, for all his coin, had never troubled to understand about the animals he owned. He thought of them as a single thing called the beasts, an undifferentiated mass of appetite that existed to kill whatever he put in front of it. He had never once considered that the Drenig were terrified of the Breaker, that the Silence gave off something that made the swimmer refuse to share water with it, that the warden, largest and oldest of them all, was regarded by every other creature in that bowl as the apex of a food chain none of them wanted to be at the bottom of. Osric had thrown 5 starving Deathworld predators into a small space together and called it a spectacle. What he had actually built was a powder keg, and Mara Voss had just walked into it holding the only thing that could either set it off or diffuse it, which was the truth about what to be afraid of. The Drenig came for her first. They knew ledges. They were plains hunters, and they understood high ground and the cutting off of retreat, and they poured along the broken rim of the bowl toward her ledge in a low, fast, fluid line, quills flat, jaws open. The crowd surged up in their seats. This was more like it. This was what they had paid for. Mara had perhaps 4 seconds. She spent the first one not running, because running from a courser was the surest way to die a courser had ever devised. The run was the trigger. The run was the whole point. The run was what their entire bodies had been shaped across 1,000,000 years to chase down and kill. She spent the second finding the largest of the 6, the one that ran a half-length ahead of the others, the one the pack's eyes flicked to, the leader. She spent the third second doing the hardest thing she had ever done, which was to take 1 step toward it. And she spent the 4th second making herself as large as she could, arms wide, chin up, and letting out a single hard bark of sound from the bottom of her lungs, a flat percussive shout with no fear in it, aimed straight down the throat of the lead animal. The pack broke stride. It was not much. It was a stutter, a half-second of confusion. 6 animals whose entire strategy depended on a fleeing target suddenly presented with a small thing that had stepped toward them and gotten larger and made a noise like a challenge. In the wild, on their own world, a prey animal that did that was either sick, or cornered and about to fight in a way that could cost a hunter an eye, or not prey at all. The pack's instincts threw an error. The lead Drennig planted its forelegs and skidded, and its packmates piled up behind it in a snarling not 2 body lengths from the ledge, and for 1 heartbeat everything hung in the balance. Mara used the heartbeat. She did not press the advantage into aggression, because aggression would have resolved their confusion in the worst direction. Instead, she held the large posture and let her voice drop out of the bark and into the low, steady tone, the same one she had used on the warden, pitched under the crowd for the animals alone. "Easy," she said. "Easy now. You do not want this. I am not the thing that hurt you. Look at me. Nothing here has hurt you except the ones up there in the walls." She took a slow half-step back, giving them room, uncornering them, showing them she was not going to force the fight. "You have been in the dark a long time. I know. Easy." The lead Drennig stood over its planted forelegs with its quills half-raised, caught between 2 ancient imperatives, and Mara watched its eyes and its ears and the set of its shoulders, and read it the way she read a strained support beam, listening for the direction it wanted to fail in. And slowly, the quills came down. Not all the way, but down. The animal's head lowered a fraction and turned, 1 ear swiveling back toward the goad ports in the wall, toward the place the pain had always come from, and Mara saw the exact moment its attention shifted off her and onto the real problem, and she felt something in her chest that was almost joy. Then the breaker hit the pack from the side. It had crossed the bowl while everyone watched the Drennig, and it came in swinging, and its first blow caught the rearmost courser and flung it against the wall, and the whole delicate near-piece Mara had built shattered in an instant into snapping and shrieking chaos. The Drennig scattered. The breaker bellowed and swung again. And Mara, flat against the wall on her narrow ledge, understood 2 things at once. First, that the handlers had driven the breaker into the pack on purpose, because Osric could see the piece forming too and would not have it. And second, that she had just watched proof of her entire theory, because the Drennig attacked had not turned on her. They had turned on the breaker, and they had turned, half of them, to look at the walls. "Pell," Osric's voice in the box had gone soft and cold. "What is happening in my pit?" "I do not know, Magnate." Pell's fingers were slick on the controls. "She is doing something to them. I have never the Drennig had her. They had her cold and they stopped. I do not understand it. She is unteaching them." Osric stared down at the small figure on the ledge, and for the first time in a very long time the Cathari magnate felt something he could not immediately convert into coin and did not enjoy the feeling. "Every one of those animals we taught it the same lesson. Prey runs, prey spikes. Hunt the spike, the pain stops. She's standing down there teaching them a different lesson in front of my paying crowd." He leaned forward. "Drive them all onto her. Now. I do not care about the card anymore. I want her dead before she finishes the sentence." Down in the bowl, Mara had run out of ledge. The breaker had turned from the scattered Drennig and fixed its small red eyes on her, and it came, and there was no reasoning with the first rush of a thing like that, no clever posture, no low kind voice, because it had been bred stupid and angry on purpose, and it was between her and every route of retreat. She had one option, and it was a bad one, and she took it, because a bad option taken fast beats a good option taken too late, another thing the mines had taught her. She turned and she dove off the ledge, into the dark water, into the warden's water, 3 meters down into the cold. The crowd screamed with delight. This, at last, was the death they had come for. The little Deathworld thing had thrown herself into the deep with the blind leviathan, and now the water would give them the ending, and the discomfort of the last few minutes would be washed away in the clean, simple pleasure of watching something small get eaten by something large. The cold hit Mara like a fist and drove the air half out of her. The water was darker than she had imagined, a pressing black that swallowed the spotlights within a body length of the surface, and the noise of the crowd vanished into a muffled thrum, and she was suddenly alone in the element that had killed more of her fellow miners than any cave-in ever had. She kicked, oriented, found the pale, wavering rectangle of light that was the surface, and knew she had seconds before the swimmer found her, or the breaker followed her down, or the warden's slow patience finally resolved into a strike. And she felt the water move. It came up from below, a vast slow pressure of displaced mass, the same cool wall of moving water she had felt on the ledge, and she knew what it was, and there was no time to reach the surface and nowhere to go if she had. So Mara Voss did the only thing left to her, which was to trust the reed she had made with her life on the line and hold to it now with her lungs burning. She stopped kicking away. She turned in the black water toward the rising presence. She made herself slow. She made herself calm. She opened her hands. The blunt gray head rose up out of the dark beneath her, enormous, close, the sensory pits pulsing their cold blue light so that for one strange suspended instant she could see, lit from below in that dim eldritch glow, the ancient scarred architecture of the creature that had been built to kill her. Its jaws could have taken her, and the water around her in a single closing. Its whole terrible attention was on the small, warm heartbeat hanging helpless in its element. Mara reached out one open hand, slow and steady, into the black water, and she laid it flat against the cold hide of the warden's snout, the way she might have laid a hand on the hull of a ship she was asking to hold together one more hour. And in the muffled dark with the last of her air, she did not fight and she did not flee and she did not spike. And the warden, feeling under its snout the small, steady drum of a heart that refused to be afraid of it, went still. The whole bowl held its breath. And then the warden rose, gently, deliberately, carrying the small human upward on the broad, blunt shelf of its head, and it broke the surface into the light and the noise, and Mara Voss came up out of the killing water riding the skull of the ossuary pit's greatest monster, gasping air into her starved lungs, alive. The crowd did not scream this time. The crowd fell silent, a silence so total and so sudden that the hum of the station's air recyclers became audible in the great stone bowl. Thousands of creatures of 100 species stared down at a thing that could not be happening, and in his private box, Osric Vane rose slowly to his feet, and for the first time in the entire history of the ossuary pit, the owner of the pit was afraid. Silence in a crowd of thousands is a physical thing. It has weight. It presses. Mara Voss knelt on the broad, wet shelf of the warden's skull, water sheeting off her, her lungs dragging in the thick, recycled air, and she felt the silence press down from every tier of the great bowl, and she understood that she had reached the exact hinge of the night. What she did in the next minute would decide everything. The crowd had come for one story and been handed another, and a crowd handed a story it did not order will either riot against the teller or fall in love with them, and there is no way to know which until it happens. She did not try to make a speech. She had already made her speech, and speeches were for the ones in the walls anyway. Instead, she did the smallest, truest thing she could think of. She laid her hand flat again on the warden's hide, and she bowed her head to the creature, the way you bow to a thing that has spared you, a plain human gesture of thanks that needed no translation. And then she straightened and she looked, not at the crowd, but at the other beasts. They had stopped fighting. That was the thing the crowd was staring at, though most of them had not consciously registered it yet. The moment the warden had lifted her from the water, the whole ecology of the bowl had frozen. The Drennig had drawn back into a loose knot on a rock shelf, quills lowered, watching. The breaker stood chest-deep at the water's edge where it had followed her, its dull red eyes fixed on the impossible sight of the small, warm thing riding the apex, and some slow, heavy calculation was grinding behind them. The silence had flowed to the base of the far wall and gone still. Even the swimmer had surfaced, a sleek head breaking the water at a wary distance, one dark eye turned upward. Every predator in the ossuary pit was looking at Mara Voss, and not one of them was hunting her. Here is what they saw, in the different languages of their different instincts. The Drennig saw a creature that had faced the pack and not run, that had uncornered them when it could have forced a fight, that had named their true enemy in a tone their bodies understood. The breaker, dim as it was, saw the largest thing in the world submit to the smallest, and even a bread-stupid brain can read a hierarchy when it is drawn that plainly. The silence, which sensed the world in ways none of them had names for, sensed in the small warm thing an absence of the appetite that every other creature in that bowl radiated, and drew toward it the way cold things drift toward warmth. And the warden, oldest and wisest and most alone, had felt under its snout a heart that would not be afraid, and in 19 years of darkness and pain, it was the first thing it had ever encountered that it did not want to kill. None of them had a word for what Mara was, but all of them, in their different ways, had arrived at the same conclusion, and the conclusion was this: she is not the enemy, and the corollary, which every one of them had been shown by the goad and the gate and the starving dark, and which she had spoken aloud on the ledge: the enemy is in the walls. Osric Vane saw it too, and Osric Vane was no fool, whatever else he was. "Get her out of the water," he said. His voice had gone flat. "Send in the drones. Burn the animals if you have to, all of them. I am closing the pit." Pell's head jerked up. "Closing magnate, the crowd, the wagers. We have never stopped a card in the middle. They will demand. They will demand nothing when they see what I am about to show them." Osric's rings clicked as he closed his three-fingered hand into a fist. "That creature down there has just taught every animal I own that they can refuse me. Do you understand what happens to this business if a beast learns it can refuse? Every pen on this station, every fighter in every tank is held by one thing and one thing only, which is that they believe there is no other way to be. She is standing in my pit unteaching that belief in front of 9,000 paying witnesses. She does not walk out. The animals do not survive the night. And by tomorrow this never happened. Send the drones." High along the upper walls, above the goad ports, a new set of ports slid open, and out of them drifted the security drones, matte black ovoids the size of a person's torso, each mounting a stubby energy lance meant for exactly this, for the rare night when something in the pit slipped its designated role and had to be corrected. They fanned out over the water, targeting sensors sweeping red across the bowl, and they began to descend toward the small kneeling figure on the warden's skull. Mara saw them come. She had known there would be a next move. There was always a next move, and the powerful never ran out of them, only ran out of patience. She looked up at the descending drones and she felt the fear come back, sharp and electric, and she let it, because the fear was information, and the information was that Osric had decided to stop pretending. This was no longer a spectacle. This was a cleanup. She had one card left, and she had been holding it since the ledge, since the moment the warden turned away from her toward the goad port, and she understood what she was really looking at. She had been building toward it without fully admitting it to herself, the way you sometimes build toward a decision your body has already made. The card was this: every creature in the bowl now knew where the enemy was. The only thing they had never had was permission, and a target they could reach. Mara rose to her feet on the warden's skull. She lifted her arm and she pointed, not at any one goad port this time, but up, at the drones, at the walls, at the whole apparatus of the pit, and she filled her lungs. And into the vast pressing silence she gave the only order she had ever given in her life that anyone had obeyed. "UP," she roared. "The enemy is up there. Go, Geo." She did not know if it would work. She was betting everything on a read, on a theory built out of empathy and observation, and the desperate logic of a woman who had spent her life being treated as prey and had learned, in the deepest part of herself, exactly what prey needs in the moment it stops being prey. It needs to know it is not alone, and it needs to be shown the throat of the thing that has been hurting it. The warden answered first. The great blind creature had felt the drones descend, had read their approach in the vibration of the air and the water, and had understood, in whatever way it understood things, that the small warm thing on its head was in danger from the machines that came from the walls that had always been the source of the pain. And 19 years of grief and rage that had never once had anywhere to go found, at last, a direction. The warden reared its enormous body up out of the water, higher than it had ever been driven, and its lashing tail came around and caught the nearest descending drone and smashed it against the stone wall in a burst of sparks and screaming metal. And the sound it made was not the roar of pain the crowd had heard before, but something lower and more terrible, a sound of purpose. And then the whole bowl came apart. The Drennig went up the walls. They were plains coursers built to run, and they had spent their lives being goaded through ports set just above their reach. And now, with the small thing's bark still ringing in their bodies as permission, they hurled themselves at those ports with a coordinated fury that the handlers inside had never once imagined possible, because in 12 seasons no animal had ever tried to climb toward its tormentor. Quilled bodies scrabbled up the black stone. Long jaws snapped into the goad ports. Somewhere in the walls, a handler began to scream. The breaker had been bred for one quality, the willingness to hit things, and for the first time in its miserable existence, it had been shown the right things to hit. It waded to the wall and it began to strike the stone below the ports, huge slate-blue fists landing like demolition charges, and the wall, which had been built to contain animals that did not understand it could be attacked, began to crack. The silence flowed up the sheer stone as if gravity were a suggestion, pouring itself toward the drone ports, and where it reached a drone the machine simply went dark and dropped, its sensors blinded, its systems drowned in whatever the silence was. And the swimmer, the one Mara had feared most because she could never track it, turned out to be the one that mattered least to the crowd and most to the outcome, because it went for the great sluice gates at the bottom of the bowl, the mechanisms that controlled the water, and it began to work at them with a single-minded animal patience that no one was watching. In his box, Osric Vane stared down at a catastrophe unfolding at a speed he could not process. His pit, his beautiful engine of coin, the machine he had spent 30 years perfecting, was being disassembled in front of 9,000 witnesses by the very animals it was built to imprison, and at the center of it stood a small, wet human woman on the head of a leviathan, unarmed, pointing. "This is impossible," he said to no one, to the room, to the universe. "They are animals. They cannot organize. They do not have the capacity. This is—" "They are not organizing," said Pell. Osric turned. His floor master had gone a strange color, and he was staring down into the bowl with an expression that had passed through fear and out the other side into something like awe. "They are not organizing, magnate," Pell said again, very quietly. "They do not need to. She is not commanding an army. Look at them. Every one of them is doing exactly what its own nature always wanted to do. The runners run, the breaker breaks. She did not teach them anything new. She just took away the one lie that was holding them. She showed them the wall could be reached." Pell swallowed. "We built the pit to be watched, and the whole time it was watching us back. It just did not know until tonight that it was allowed." The crowd at last chose. It could have gone either way. in that hinge of the night. 9,000 creatures who had paid to watch a girl die could have turned on the sight of the pit's animals rising, could have called it an abomination, could have cheered when the drones finally cut the small woman down. But a crowd is made of creatures too, and every creature in that bowl had, somewhere in its own history, been small before something large, had been made to run, had been treated as prey or asset or spectacle by something with more coin and more teeth. And when they saw the small human stand on the skull of the monster and point at the walls, and saw the walls begin to break, something moved through 9,000 chests that was older than the trade tongue and stronger than the price of a ticket. They began to stamp their feet, not against her, for her. A slow rolling thunder that started in the cheap high tiers where the dockworkers and the debtors and the small forgotten people sat, and rolled down through the bowl until the whole station rang with it, a drumbeat of thousands, a sound that said go, 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 break it down. Mara Voss stood in the center of the rising storm she had made, soaked and shaking and alive, and she looked up at the trembling walls and the falling drones and the stamping thousands, and she did not feel triumph. Triumph was too small a word and too clean a feeling. What she felt was recognition. She had spent her whole life being told what she was by people who owned her, and she had never once believed them. And now, for one impossible moment in a stone bowl at the edge of nowhere, the whole galaxy was watching her be right. But the night was not over, and Osric Vane had not run out of moves. And the most dangerous thing about a cornered, powerful man is that, when he can no longer profit from a thing, he would rather destroy it than let it walk away and be remembered. "The water," Osric said, and his voice had gone very calm, the calm of a creature that has decided to lose everything rather than be defied. "Purge the water. Flood the bowl to the rim and vent it out the lower sluice into vacuum. Drown them all. Her, the animals, all of it. If they will not perform, they will disappear, and I will rebuild the pit next season with beasts that have never heard of Mara Voss." Pell's hand did not move toward the controls. Osric turned to look at him slowly. "Magnate," Pell said, and the little coward who had spent his whole life reading rooms for the exit looked, for the first time, like he had found a door he actually wanted to walk through. "There are 9,000 witnesses, and she is a human, a deathworlder. Do you know what happens to a station that drowns a human in front of 9,000 people who just watched her survive the pit?" He shook his head slowly. "I have read a great many rooms in my life, Magnate. I have never read one like this. You cannot sell what is happening down there, but if you kill it, you cannot survive what comes after either." He stepped back from the controls. "I am not purging the water. I resign my post. I would rather owe you money for the rest of my life than be the creature who pulled that lever." For one long moment, Osric Vane stood alone in his box above the breaking pit, and every choice he had ever made narrowed down to the single lever in front of him, and the whole galaxy, it seemed, was waiting to see what kind of thing he truly was. While the magnate stood frozen over his lever, the bowl below him kept moving, and Mara Voss kept working, because she had learned long ago that the powerful hesitating is not the same as the powerful stopping, and the only thing to do with the gap is to use it. The warden had carried her back to the tumbled rock at the water's edge, and she moved among the animals now the way she had once moved among a work crew in the last hour of a doubled shift, checking each of them, reading each of them, spending herself on each of them in turn. She did not think of it as leadership. She would not have known the word for what she was doing. She only knew that a frightened thing steadies faster when something calm comes near it and stays, and so she went near and she stayed. Above her, the Drennig still worried at the goad ports, and the breaker still battered its great crack into the wall. But the first wild fury had passed, and in the space it left she could do the quieter work. She went first to the Drennig that had fallen back to the shelf, because the Drennig were the most likely to break toward panic, being pack animals wired for flight. The lead one, the big one she had barked down, stood at the edge of the shelf with a long gash along its flank where the breaker's blow had caught it, and its sides heaved, and its gold eyes rolled white at the edges every time a drone sparked and fell. Mara crouched a body length from it, not closer, and she made herself small and slow the way she had on the ledge, and she talked to it in the low tone, nonsense words, kind words, the register under the words. "You are all right," she said. "You are all right. That is a bad cut, but I have had worse and walked 10 kilometers on it. You are fast and you are clever and you kept your pack together. Look at them. They are all watching you. They are waiting to see if you are all right, so let us show them you are all right. Slow breath. There. There." And the lead Drenig, which had spent its life reading the calm or panic of the animal beside it because that was how a pack survived, read the small warm thing crouched near it and found it calm, and took the calm, the way pack animals take calm, and passed it down the line, and the white edges went out of its eyes. She went to the breaker next, and the breaker was the hardest, because there was so little behind its small red eyes to reach. It had done what it was bred to do. It had cracked the wall, and now it stood in the ruin of its own strength half lost, because a thing bred for a single purpose is undone when the purpose runs thin. Mara knew that feeling too. She did not crouch small before the breaker, because smallness meant nothing to it. Instead she stood square and steady and put her hand flat on the great slate-blue forearm, high as she could reach, and she let it feel the steadiness through her palm, and she gave it a thing to hold onto in the only language it had, which was the language of tasks. She pointed at a fallen slab of rubble too heavy for anything else in the bowl to shift, a slab lying across the low ground between the water and the cracked wall. "Move that," she said, and put her whole small weight against it uselessly, showing it the shape of the want, and the breaker looked at the slab and looked at the small thing straining against it, and reached down and lifted the slab away as easily as a person lifts a cup, and something that was almost satisfaction moved across its heavy face, and Mara said, "Yes, that, good, you are so strong. We are going to need you to be strong." And the breaker rumbled low in its chest and stayed close to her after that, a demolition tool that had, for the first time, been thanked. The silence she could not touch and did not try. It sat in its dark ribbon along the wall and watched her with its many small reflections, and she understood, without knowing how she understood, that it was not something she was going to reach with a hand or a task or a tone. So she did the only honest thing, which was to look at it directly and not flinch, and speak to it as if it could understand every word, because maybe it could. "I do not know what you are," she said. "I do not think anyone here does. I do not know if you feel any of this the way the rest of us do. But I know they put you in the dark and starved you and pointed you at things to kill, and I know you did not ask for any of it, and I am not going to pretend I understand you in order to make you a tool the way they did. You can come with us or you can go your own way when we reach the doors, but nobody is going to sell your pain again either. That is all I have got. That is all I have got for any of you." And the silence rippled once and flowed a little closer and stayed within reach of her but never touched her, and that, Mara understood, was its answer, and she respected it. And all the while, up in his box, Osric Vane's hand rested on the lever and did not move, because a part of the magnate that he had spent 30 years starving had woken up in the dark of the failing pit and was whispering to him. He was watching her move among the animals. He could not stop watching. He had thrown 10,000 creatures into that bowl over 3 decades, and he had watched every one of them either kill or die. And he had built an entire fortune on the certainty that those were the only 2 things that could happen in a pit. And here was a small wet human proving him wrong in a third way he had never once imagined. A way that was neither killing nor dying, but something he had no word for. Some old warm thing that his own kind had probably possessed once, long ago. Before they learned that everything could be counted and sold, he watched her put her hand on the breaker. He watched the breaker lift the slab. He watched a thing that had been sold to him as pure engine of destruction be spoken to like a person and become, in the space of a breath, less like a weapon, and more like what it must have been on whatever world it came from before the brokers took it. And Osric Vane, magnate of the ossuary pit, felt the lever under his hand and understood, with a clarity that frightened him more than any animal ever had, that if he pulled it, he would be killing the last proof that a third thing was possible. Not just proof for the crowd, proof for himself. He would go on being what he was, and he would rebuild the pit, and he would count the coin, and he would never again in his life have to look at the small, warm shape of a thing he could have been. That was why his hand shook. Not fear of the crowd, though the crowd was reason enough. Not fear of the workers on the docks, though they were coming for him too in their slow, inevitable way. What made the great gray hand tremble on the cold metal was the oldest fear there is, older than any Deathworld predator, the fear of a creature that has been shown, too late and too clearly, exactly what it has traded away. Below, Mara finished with the animals, and she straightened, and she turned her face up at last toward the cracked and groaning wall, and the service tunnels she knew waited beyond it, because there was always a way out if you were willing to climb toward it. She did not look up at the magnate's box. She had said everything she had to say to Osric Vane on the ledge, and she would say the rest at the docks, and in between there was only the work of getting the desperate and the wounded and the strange out of a place that had been built to be their grave. She set her stance, and she waited for the wall to give, and she gathered the animals to her with nothing but her low, steady voice, and the whole ruined bowl seemed to hold itself in the breath before a thing breaks. Osric Vane reached for the lever. He was a creature of coin, and coin is a kind of certainty, and he had spent 30 years believing that with enough of it a thing could always be made to disappear. His three-fingered hand closed on the cold metal. And in the water below, the swimmer finished its patient work on the sluice mechanism, and the great gate at the bottom of the bowl shuddered, and the whole balance of the pit shifted, and Osric Vane felt the floor of his box tremble as 30 years of certainty began, quietly, to fail. He did not get to pull the lever. The breaker had been striking the same section of wall for 4 minutes with the patient, stupid fury it had been bred for, and the wall, cracked and overstressed, and never once designed to be attacked from the inside, chose that moment to give. A section of black stone the size of a shuttle sheared away and fell into the water, and with it went the goad ports and the drone housings, and a length of the conduit that carried power up from the station core to the magnate's box, and the lights in the ossuary pit flickered, dimmed, and for 3 full seconds went out entirely. In the dark, Mara Voss did the thing she had been made for. She had spent her life in the dark, 40-hour shifts in a soot lamp's small circle, collapsed shafts with the power dead and the air thinning, the lightless belly of asteroids that had never known a sun. Darkness held no terror for her. Darkness was simply the condition under which she had learned to do everything that mattered. So while 9,000 creatures of 100 species sat blind and stunned in the sudden black, and while Osric Vane groped for a lever he could no longer see, Mara moved. "With me," she called out low and steady into the dark, and she did not shout it as a command but pitched it as an invitation, the tone she had used on all of them, the tone that said, "I am here, you are not alone, come. This way, all of you, with me." The emergency lighting came up a moment later, dim red strips along the tiers, and in that bloody half-light the crowd saw the thing that none of them would ever forget, the thing that would be told and retold across 40 worlds until it stopped being news and became a story, and then stopped being a story and became something closer to a prayer. They saw the animals gather to her. The warden had brought itself to the base of the fallen wall, and it lowered its great blind head, and Mara stepped down off its skull onto the tumbled slope of broken stone the breaker had made, a rough ramp of shattered rock leading up out of the bowl toward the shattered wall and the service tunnels beyond. And she began to climb. And behind her, without being driven, without a goad or a gate or a single lever pulled by any hand in any wall, the predators of the ossuary pit followed her up out of the dark. The Drennig came first, the 6 of them or the 5 that were left, flowing up the broken stone in a loose protective arc around her, quills lowered, heads swiveling, No longer a pack of coursers, but something that had no name yet, an escort. The breaker came behind, hauling its heavy body up the ramp it had made, and where the stone was too steep it simply broke a new path, and the Drennig had learned in the space of one night not to fear it, because it was pointed the same way they were now. The silence poured up the wall alongside them, a dark ribbon in the red light. And last came the warden, unable to leave the water, but it followed her to the very edge of it and reared up one final time, and it made that low sound of purpose, and every creature in the bowl understood it as a farewell and a blessing from the oldest of them to the small warm thing that had shown them the wall could be reached. Mara stopped at the top of the ramp, at the jagged mouth of the broken wall, and she turned and looked back down at the warden in the red-lit water. The blind old leviathan from the drowned world of Ith could not see her. It had never been able to see her. But its sensory pits pulsed their slow blue light, reading her heartbeat one last time across the gap, and Mara laid her hand flat on the broken stone in the gesture she had made on its snout. "Thank you," and she said, quiet enough that only the two of them and 9,000 straining witnesses could hear it. "I cannot take you where you came from. I wish I could. Nobody can, but I promise you this. Nobody is ever going to sell a ticket to your pain again." Then she turned and led the rest of them up into the walls. What happened in the next hour became the thing the whole galaxy argued about afterward, and the arguing missed the point, because the arguing was about logistics and jurisdiction and property law, and the thing that had actually happened was not about any of those. But the logistics went like this. Mara Voss led 4 kinds of Deathworld predator out of the ossuary pit and into the service corridors of Grelmer's Deep, and the handlers fled before them, and the guards with their shock poles took one look at a hallway filling with the very animals they had spent careers tormenting, animals that now had somewhere to be and someone to follow, and they threw down their poles and ran. Not one of them stood. There is no wage high enough to make a creature stand in a corridor against a thing that has learned it can reach the wall. The pit's whole apparatus of control had rested, as Pell had understood in his last moment of employment, on a single lie, and the lie was broken, and a broken lie has no weight at all. She did not lead them on a rampage. That surprised everyone later, and it should not have. A rampage was what a monster would do, and Mara had spent the whole night proving there were no monsters here, only creatures that had been made desperate by things that called themselves civilized. She led them, instead, toward the docks. She had spent the climb doing arithmetic again, the cold, clear arithmetic of the mines, and the arithmetic said that 4 starving alien predators loose on a populated station was a catastrophe for everyone, including the predators, and that the only ending that did not drown in blood was one where they got off the station entirely. She found the docks because a miner always knows where the ships are, and she found at the docks the second thing that decided the night, which was that word travels faster than a person can walk, especially on a station full of small forgotten people who had just watched a small forgotten woman do the impossible. They were waiting for her. Not guards, not Osric's people, the other kind. The dockworkers and the debtors and the indentured haulers, the ones who crewed the ships and cleaned the halls and lost their years to the same magnates who owned the pit, the ones who had been stamping their feet in the high cheap tiers an hour ago. They had heard. They had come down to the docks, and they had done a thing that no one had asked them to do, and that would cost some of them dearly, which was that they had opened up a ship. An old bulk hauler, a slab-sided ore transport with holds big enough to swallow a leviathan, the kind of ship Mara had crewed a dozen times, the kind of ship that no one would miss quickly and everyone could pretend had simply been stolen. A woman with grease worked into the lines of her hands stood at the head of the boarding ramp, and she looked at Mara Voss, and she looked at the impossible procession behind her, and she said the thing that the whole galaxy would eventually put on the story like a title. "We heard you told them the enemy was in the walls." The dockworker's voice was rough and low. "Some of us have been trying to say that our whole lives and nobody ever listened. Get them aboard, Deathworlder. The holds are flooded for the big one. Fuel's topped. We'll say she was taken at gunpoint and cut the cameras an hour ago." She almost smiled. "Fastest wreck diver on this station rigged the water lift for your leviathan. Told me to tell you she used to work the tannic belt too. Said she remembered a girl named Voss who once split her own air ration 3 ways in a dead shaft so nobody had to draw straws." The woman's eyes were bright. "Small galaxy. Go on, before Vane finds a spine." Getting the warden aboard was the hardest thing, and the wreck divers rigged water lift and 40 volunteers, and the breakers' raw strength did it between them. A flooded ore hold and a leviathan lowered into it inch by careful inch, and Mara stood in the water with it the whole time, her hand on its hide, her voice low and steady, until the last of it slid under and the hold sealed, and the great blind thing floated free in more water than it had known since Ith. The Drennig loaded themselves. The silence flowed into a dark cargo bay and went still. And the swimmer, which had followed them all the way from the sluice gate through the flooded lower corridors, poured itself up the loading ramp and into the flooded hold with the warden, and would not be parted from it. Osric Vane arrived at the docks with the last of his private security as the boarding ramp was rising. He had not pulled the lever. In the end, with the power failing and Pell gone and his beautiful engine of coin coming apart, some old instinct of self-preservation had stopped his hand, and he had fled his box, and now he stood on the dock plating with a dozen armed guards and watched the single largest asset of his life walk up the ramp of a stolen ship. He was not a stupid creature. He could count. A dozen guards against a flooded hold full of leviathan, and a dock crowded with 100 workers who had stopped being afraid of him. An hour ago was not a fight. It was a math problem with only one answer. "Voss!" His voice carried across the plating, and Mara stopped, halfway up the ramp, and turned. The magnate of the ossuary pit looked at the small, wet human woman who had cost him everything, and there was no coin in his eyes now, only the raw, bewildered rage of a creature that had never once in 30 years been told no. "You think this is a victory. You think you have freed something. You have stolen my property, and you have made yourself a fugitive, and you have loosed monsters on the galaxy. And everywhere you go, everywhere, someone like me will be waiting, because the galaxy runs on pits, Deathworlder. It runs on them. You cannot free everything. You are one small animal from one dead world, and the whole sky is full of walls." Mara Voss looked down at him from the ramp, and she was tired in a way that went all the way to the bone, and she did not feel like a legend, and she did not feel like a symbol. She felt like a woman who had been awake too long and nearly died too many times. But she found, somewhere, the last of her voice, and she gave the magnate the only answer that was true. "You are right," she said. "I cannot free everything. I am one small animal from one dead world." She let that sit a moment. "But I stood in your pit tonight, and I looked at the deadliest thing you owned, and instead of a monster, I saw somebody who had been dragged out of their home and hurt for the amusement of people who called them a monster to keep from having to look at what they were doing. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. That is the thing you never understood about what you built, Vane. You could starve them and beat them and put them in the dark, but the day one of them found out the wall could be reached, it was over. It was always going to be over. You just did not know which day." She looked past him at the 100 workers on the dock, the ones who had opened the ship, the ones who had cut the cameras, the ones who had stopped being afraid. "And it turns out," she said, "it was not just the animals who were waiting to find that out." The ramp sealed. The old bulk hauler's engines lit, and Osric Vane stood on the dock plating and watched his greatest asset and his deadliest monster, and his whole beautiful engine of coin, lift off the deck and turn toward the black and go. And behind him, the 100 workers did not cheer exactly. They simply watched it leave, in a silence that had weight, the same silence that had pressed down on the bowl, and every one of them understood that a thing had happened tonight that could not be unhappened, and that the walls of Grelmer's Deep, which had stood for 30 years, had a crack in them now that no amount of coin would ever fully close. The hauler cleared the station's shadow and found the open dark. Mara Voss stood on the bridge, a borrowed ship under her hands, and looked out at the stars, and for a while she did not think about where she was going, because she did not know, and for once the not knowing did not frighten her. Behind and below her, in the flooded main hold, the warden drifted in its water, the blind old leviathan from the drowned world, and through the deck plating she could feel the low, resonant thrum of the sound it made, the sound of purpose, and beside it the swimmer turned its lazy circles, and in the dry holds the drennig had curled together to sleep for the first time in months without fear, and the silence sat in its dark bay and was, in whatever way it knew how to be, at peace. She had not planned to become anything. She had planned, in the tunnel under the seating, only to not die badly, and then only to not die at all, and then only to buy the blind old creature that had spared her one moment of not being tortured. Each choice had been small. She had made every one of them the way she made every choice, by looking at the thing in front of her honestly, and asking what was true, and the truth had led her, one small honest step at a time, out of a pit that no one had ever left and into a story that would outlive her by 1,000 years. That was the part the galaxy got wrong afterward when it made her into a legend. It said she was fearless. She was not fearless. She had been afraid the entire time, and she would tell anyone who asked that the fear had never once left her, that the fear had been her most useful tool, that the trick was never to feel no fear but to refuse to let the fear decide what you were. It said she had a gift, some deathworlder magic that let her tame monsters. She had no gift. What she had was the plain, hard-won knowledge of a person who had been treated as an asset her whole life, and had never once believed it, and had looked at the deadliest predators in the galaxy, and recognized, in every one of them, the same thing she saw when she looked in a mirror, which was not a monster and not an asset but a living thing that had been lied to about what it was allowed to be. The story spread the way she had known it would, faster than any ship, carried by the 100 workers on the dock and the 9,000 witnesses in the tiers, and the recordings that Osric Vane could never fully suppress. It reached other stations. It reached other pits. And on those other stations, in those other pits, small forgotten people began, here and there, to look at the walls a little differently, and to wonder, for the first time, whether the walls could be reached. Some of them found out that they could. That was Mara Voss's real legacy, and it had nothing to do with taming beasts. It was a question, loose in the galaxy now and impossible to call back, whispered from one small creature to another in the dark holds and the deep shafts and the lightless bottoms of every world that had ever been called dead. The enemy is in the walls, and the walls can be reached. But that was all still to come. On the night this story ends, there was only an old ore hauler running dark toward the edge of everything, and a young woman from a dead world standing watch on its bridge, tired and scared and entirely herself, with the deadliest predators in the galaxy sleeping safe behind her, following her not because she had beaten them but because, for the first time in any of their lives, someone had walked into the dark where they lived and offered them, instead of a goad, an open hand. The warden's low sound rose up through the deck one more time, and Mara Voss put her palm flat against the cold plating, and answered it, in the tone that needed no translation. "I know," she said softly to all of them, to the whole sleeping hold of things the galaxy had called monsters. "I know, me too. Rest now. We are a long way from any pit, and we are not going back." And the ship ran on into the dark, and the dark, for once, held nothing that any of them needed to fear.